Good afternoon. Thank you for participating in another installment of our SCR webinar series. With us today is Ken Wingate, Chairman of the South Carolina Commission on Higher Education, and Dr. Garrison Walters, Executive Director. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Kathy. We're really pleased to be here and to talk to you a little bit about the knowledge economy and the relationship of it to higher education and the kinds of things we can do to make our state stronger economically. Our first slide, we talked quite a bit about the knowledge economy, and if we go a little bit further, there we have a slide that shows how the knowledge economy is a shift to knowledge-based content. A lot of people say, how can we have a different economy? Don't we have to make things still isn't manufacturing the core of our economy? And this slide just to illustrate if it was 1800 and somebody brought you a bushel of wheat, pretty much 100% of the content of that would be in labor and raw materials. Certainly some knowledge passed down. About 100 years later, a Model T Ford, it would be pretty much the same, that 90% of that would be in labor and unskilled labor. But as we get into the 21st century, things begin to change very substantially. You see in the chart that BMW says that about 25% of the value of a new car as of 2008 is in knowledge, the skills and the information. Only about 75% is in labor and raw materials of the car. They predict that by 2015 it will be 50-50. Kind of a more extreme example, one of the things we pay a lot of money for these days is the microprocessor in our computers. A very generous estimate of the value that is that 10% of it is in unskilled labor and raw materials. The rest is in highly knowledgeable people. And the most extreme example of all, and I suspect many of the members here have had occasion recently buy a copy of Microsoft Office for $3 or so. And what do they give you? They give you a little flimsy plastic case and a CD. And that's all. And probably 1/10 of 1% of that is in labor and raw materials, and the rest is in knowledge, not to mention Bill Gates' cut. So the economy is changing away from traditional manufacturing. We always have some of that toward a basis on knowledge. So where in the next slide do we see that South Carolina stands in the knowledge economy? The answer is we're very far behind economically. And one of the reasons for that is we are one of the very few states in the Southeast, not to mention higher education. We're going to talk today about lack of public priority focus on education, higher education. Second is a lack of individual focus, maybe a better term than public higher education. So let's go and talk about some basic information. How bad is our status today? Well, in the next slide, you see that in per capita personal income, we're in the bottom fifth of the state, so bottom 10. And that is a situation that is not getting better. If you see the change, we've gone in 1990 from 40th to 2008, 45th. Those annual numbers bounce around a little bit, but the bottom line is we are not making progress versus. So what's the reason for that? Well, the next slide, we're saying that we believe the data shows that the major reason is that we're not doing well in higher education. So you look at where we stand compared to the states in higher education. In this case, we use the percentage of the population 25 and over that has a bachelor's degree. We use a bachelor's degree because it's a standard measure that's consistent across the nation. The associate degree is extremely important, increasing in importance. Graduate professional degrees are important too. But if you take that basic metric, you see we're in the bottom 10 in higher education levels too. And one thing we really want to emphasize is there is a direct and causal relationship between lack of education levels, lack of higher education levels, and lack of per capita income in an economy that is focused on knowledge and where educated people are valued more. So if we go on to the next slide to illustrate the lack of focus on higher education in our state, we'll give you a few slides, and you'll have access to these. So I'm not going to read all the numbers to you. But here is one that we think is really striking, and it shows that in just recent 18-year period, that the share of the state budget that has gone to higher education has declined from 15% to just about 10%. And every state agency and everything that receives support from the state certainly has lost money. But what we're saying here is the state is making higher education a relatively lower priority in its budget just at the time that the economy is switching to focus on. So we'll show you a few more examples here. The next one shows that the dollar figures that we're receiving in state support for higher education are actually lower than they were in 1992. The next slide at the bottom shows that this is occurring, actual lower state support is occurring at a time that there is significant increasing demand for higher education. That's not surprising because it's knowledge economy. People realize that they need higher education, but the state support is actually so we have some more data here on next slide. This one I think is really important because it illustrates something that I mentioned earlier, that we're really one of the few states in the Southeast, not to mention, that is not focused on higher education as a way to build and drive the economy. You know, the states in the Southeast came out of the Second World War relatively weaker economically, have been looking for comparative advantage, things that they can do to be more successful. Most of those states have focused on education, including higher education, to get competitive advantage. The Southeast region is rising substantially versus the nation. Great examples are our neighbors, North Carolina and Georgia. South Carolina is one of just a couple of states not making that. And I'll talk a little bit about the kinds of things we think we need to do to change that situation.
Thank you, Gary. And let me say at the outset what a privilege it is for both me and Gary to be with you today for this seminar. We, as representatives of the higher education community, both in my capacity as chair of the Commission on Higher Education and Gary as the executive director, appreciate the opportunity to reach out to the business community. And of course, you, the realtors, are on the very front lines in interacting with the public in South Carolina, in knowing and feeling firsthand the impact of the economy, things that we can do together to enhance economic development. So thank you for this opportunity to talk about this very important public priority that is higher education. As you see on the slide before you on the screen, one of the things that we need to do is to implement what is called the Action Plan for Higher Education. You'll see on the next slide just a little bit of the background about this. Over the last couple of years, starting in 2007, the General Assembly appointed a study committee, a blue ribbon panel of businessmen and women around the state who had a vested interest through their business backgrounds and also a great depth of business experience in looking at higher education in South Carolina. That committee did its work under the leadership of a realtor, broker in Charleston, Dan Ravenel, and in 2009 came back to the General Assembly with their recommendations, or what was called the Action Plan for Higher Education in South Carolina. There were three very broad goals that were defined, and we want to go now through those one by one. And Gary has already indicated that one of the things we need to do in South Carolina is to raise the educational levels. Gary indicated that the bachelor's degree, a four-year degree, is the base level, the standard measure, if you will, of educational attainment. And so one of the things that the study committee did was to first look at the important question, how many adults in South Carolina, as a percentage of the total population, actually hold a bachelor's degree or higher? And as you see here, our specific goal, as identified by this study committee, is to take the current level, which is at 23%, that is 23% of our adults in South Carolina hold a four-year degree or higher, meaning some sort of graduate or professional degree on top of their bachelor's, and to raise that level to 30%. We call this 30 by 30. That is the goal that by the year 2030, 30% of the adults in South Carolina would hold this four-year degree. Now, it's not just percentage increases for the sake of percentage increases. We'll talk in just a few moments more specifically in concrete terms, dollars and cents, what impact these degrees have on both the individuals and on the state as a whole. But it is noteworthy that this focus on attaining a higher level of education should be targeted towards specific areas that will make the quickest difference, the most tangible difference for our state. Areas such as nursing or other healthcare functions, engineering, health technology, obviously a growing front on the development of jobs and opportunities in South Carolina, and then various forms of management for the business community, teacher education, and the like. So raising those education levels is critical. A second major goal that was developed by the study committee as part of the action plan is to increase research and innovation. As Gary has already discussed, looking at the progress over the last century, from what does it take to develop a bushel of wheat, and that being very little in the way of technology, more raw materials and unskilled labor, to where we find ourselves in today's economy, there's no question that under the leadership of our research universities, we need to drive innovation. Take that developing technology from the lab, so to speak, and put it into the storefronts. We need to create businesses that create jobs, that bring richer opportunities to all South Carolinians. And to do this, as this slide indicates, there's certainly an enhancement of what's called a culture of discovery that we are pursuing under the leadership, again, of many of our institutions in South Carolina. Secondly, optimizing technology transfer. As developments occur at USC in fuel cell research, or as developments occur at MUSC in terms of healthcare technologies, how do we then transfer that information, those new technologies, into the marketplace? And finally, how do we enhance partnerships among the colleges and universities with the public sector? All of those are part of this goal to increase research and innovation. Third major goal of the action plan, and this should be near and dear to the hearts of all of the business community and realtors around the state, is to improve workforce training and education services. Clearly, the availability of a highly skilled workforce is key to recruiting businesses to our state. We've seen the perfect example of this in recent months with the announcement by Boeing of their plan to move from Washington State to South Carolina for this large manufacturing facility. Part of the negotiations, part of the package that was put together to bring Boeing to South Carolina involved the availability of Trident Tech and other institutions in the Charleston community to train and make available to Boeing a skilled workforce who had readily transferable skills ready to go into service for that company. So we need to align programs at the colleges, universities, and technical colleges with these significant economic clusters. We need to create reverse bridge programs, finding ways to facilitate students, whether they are traditional students coming out of high school or adult students who've been out of the education process for a number of years, find ways to get back into the higher education system. I really want to focus for just a moment on that fourth bullet point, connecting adults to education and training programs. There's no question that to attain the levels of higher education that we propose, that is the 30% by the year 2030, that it will take more than just high school seniors graduating and determining to go on to college. It will also require adults, that 40-year-old, that 50-year-old who has been out of the education system for a decade or two, to find his or her way back into the classroom. And to do that, it has special challenges. Imagine yourself a 50-year-old man or woman who has not been in a basic English class or math class for the last 20 or 25 years, facing the daunting task of going back into a classroom, sitting down side by side with other students, maybe half of your age, and trying to get back into the educational system. So we are working at the Commission on Higher Education with our institutions to create certificate programs, and we will get more information out over the coming months to specifically how these certificate programs will work, but that's a vital part of our plan. Also, the fifth bullet point there, identifying financial pathways. Clearly, there are a number of government resources, both federal and state funds, available to students in order to get back into the education system or to continue in the education system. Helping students identify financial pathways is a critical part of our mission as a state. It's one thing to not go back to school or continue with school because resources are not available. That is a very significant problem. But what a shame, what more of a problem is it when the resources are really available and the people just simply do not know how to connect with those resources. So making those financial resources available is another part of this priority. Let's go to the next slide and emphasize that even in this down economy, and even literally with the next year's budget being considered today by the General Assembly as the current legislative session comes to a close, clearly there are a number of things that can be done that entail little cost or even no cost to the state of South Carolina. First of these is to enact regulatory relief for our higher education institutions. There are a couple of bills that have worked their way through both the House and Senate and are pending, waiting perhaps on final approval. They may or may not be reached this session. It's looking increasingly unlikely that they would be reached, but nevertheless, which provide great enhancements for relief to our higher education institutions in key areas such as human resources, the procurement code, the approval process for the creation and for the origination, I should say, and then the construction of facilities on the campuses. Again, I would think this is an area for realtors in particular that is of huge significance, because the proposals that we have worked with the higher education community to bring before the General Assembly preserve the best of public accountability. There certainly are checks and balances and various proper public hurdles that must be cleared, and yet at the same time streamline and reduce the red tape. So it would be a great thing for the realtors individually and as a group to continue to work with the General Assembly to be proponents of these regulatory relief proposals. A couple of others of these that are of significance. If you see the fourth bullet point there, increasing opportunities for relevant work experience. Again, the idea from maybe the 60s and 70s that a typical part of a higher education regime would be to have students pursue an internship. That idea in practice sort of got lost maybe in the 80s and 90s as students were in a hurry to complete their higher education. quickly getting through a 4-year curriculum, even if it takes 5 or 6 years these days on average, isn't important, but to create relevant work experience that brings on-the-job training, that brings to the employer an opportunity to see firsthand how a prospective worker may, how skilled they may be, what both tangible skills and soft skills they might bring to the job, and to give the student an opportunity for firsthand learning in a real live world context is a good idea from the past that we are working in many ways to bring back. The next, to the last bullet point I'll emphasize before we move on from this slide is that we really do want to maintain a more accurate picture of higher ed funding. Well, what in the world does this mean? There's a great misconception these days as we talk with legislators, as we and others, of course, in the higher education community, talk with members of the general public about how much money does go into higher education in South Carolina. How much of a priority in funding is it? And there's a great misconception that because of the actions of the General Assembly several years ago to implement the education lottery, that there are unlimited resources now available for students to pursue higher education degrees. This is not the case, and we need to work together to accurately present to the public a picture of our funding models. Well, as we go to the next slide, that was some of the low-cost issues. Let's touch briefly, just very quickly, on some that in years ahead will clearly require budget allocations. The first of them, as Dr. Walters indicated, is to ensure increased state funding. Closely related to this is the need for a capital bond bill. It has been a decade. It has been 10 years now since in South Carolina we had a capital bond bill, and water is piling up behind the dam. The pent-up need for facility enhancements is growing by the year, and if we're going to be competitive with our surrounding neighbors, as we'll talk about in just a few moments, North Carolina, Georgia very specifically, we've got to make a commitment to higher education to make capital funding for significant projects an ongoing and reliable source of funding. As what you do, realtors in the world of business and with individuals, the proper use, a business-like use of debt as a means of capital funding is a vital part of our economy. It should not scare us, and it's time for us to look closely. We do have capacity within our existing debt limits. No further changes are needed in that regard. And, we have a lot of opportunities there. In order to fast forward, let's look down at number 6 on this same page, the bullet point that says to create a new front door. This again goes back to that very important need to ease the transition for adult learners to get back into higher education. Well, let's look at the next slide and ask the very important question, is the juice worth the squeeze? Will it be worth investing in higher education? And before I really focus on this, I want to emphasize one point. The work of the action plan and of the study committee that developed it for the General Assembly is not an effort by higher education to feather its own nest. This is not a special interest group which wanted to find ways to create a justification for more funding for higher education in the state. If there's nothing else that you take from this seminar, this webinar today, I hope it would be this key point. Higher education is not just one more item in the budget to throw dollars at as a piece of the pie. Higher education is a way to lead South Carolina out of the doldrums. Here's the proof right here on this slide. We had the USC Darla Moore School of Business do a very detailed study, which is available on the Commission on Higher Education website if you want to read it in full detail. But the object was to look at this question. If we invest in higher education as a state, what will be the return on educational investment? The target was if we meet the goal, that is 30% of our adults having a higher ed degree by the year 2030, and if we use key metrics such as what additional per capita income would be achieved, what enhancements in the statewide gross domestic product would be achieved, what would happen to unemployment rates as they fall, what would be the additional revenue collected by the state of South Carolina on individual and corporate income taxes and other tax revenues, and then compare those receipts or revenue enhancements to the costs, the tuition and fees for the individuals who go for a degree or for their families, in addition to the state appropriations and lost earnings taken into account while a student is in college. Well, how did it match up? The result was pretty astounding. What we learned is that for the individual, if we focus on the individual first, attaining a higher ed degree, a bachelor's degree, will bring over the life expectancy of the worker $2.5 million of additional lifetime earnings. That's life-changing, folks. Now, if we look at it in terms of the state itself, there's also a striking payoff for our economy. Look at the gains annually to be achieved for South Carolina if this goal is achieved by 2030. $6.9 billion annually in total personal income enhancement, $7.8 billion in gross state product, and this is striking, an additional 45,000 permanent jobs. Translated, there's a return on investment in excess of 25 to 1. We'll see on the next slide, go to the very bottom with your, to the last bullet point, there's some other positive impacts for achieving higher ed. It's striking that for an individual, not only do they face lower unemployment, but it's interesting that their health statistics actually also improve with levels of attainment of higher education. There are lower incarceration or imprisonment rates, and so on. The benefits, both in financial terms and quality of life, are astounding. We will be working, the Commission on Higher Ed will be working to implement this action plan and present for our education institutions multi-year budgets. But here's the point, unity is the key. We want to, like our neighbors, North Carolina and South Carolina, invest much more substantially in higher education. Think with me for just a moment. We really are no different than our states in history and in the cultural fabric of our state, in basic natural resources. Clearly, we have smaller populations. Clearly, we have a smaller economy because of the smaller population. But the basic comparison is there. But the big difference is North Carolina and Georgia in the last decade or two have made the conscious decision to invest in higher education, knowing that it leads the state in economic development and in personal economic advancement. So building unity is the key. We're working with the presidents of our institutions. We're working with the General Assembly. We're working with business organizations such as the realtors to get this word out. And those obstacles, though not insignificant, are certainly insurmountable. And we'll be continuing to work with you in these important regards. Gary, you want to take back and look at some of the expansions of public awareness that we are attempting to make?
Thanks, Ken. As I mentioned, there are really two key points we want to make today. The first is that, as Ken just emphasized, that higher education needs to be much more of a public priority if we're going to get where we need to go, and that making a competitive investment in education, including higher education, has a tremendous return on investment. There's another factor that is very, very important, and that is really at an individual level. And if individuals do not believe that education, including higher education, is valuable for a high quality of life and for economic success, and that it's attainable for them and people like them, we'll never make the kind of progress that we need. To illustrate that about the issue of an education culture, we'd like to talk just very briefly about a town, Kingsport, Tennessee. You may know where that is. It's where I-26 ends at I-81. It's in Tennessee, very much in the northeast corner, right on the border with Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, and West Virginia, far away. It's a town that had one major employer, still does, Eastman Chemical, spinoff of Eastman. Founded in 1925, never had layoffs during the Great Depression. But in 1999, the leaders of Eastern Chemical, headquartered in Kingsport, said, we're going to have our first layoffs, and we're probably going to move our headquarters out of Kingsport. The reason they said was the nature of their work had changed. They were in a knowledge economy, need unskilled labor to push stuff around the factory floor anymore. They needed people with analytical skills, with technical skills, with managerial skills. In other words, people who had higher education, and they were not finding those people. The Chamber of Commerce took the lead in trying to deal with this problem. And in 2001, they announced an initiative called Educate and Grow. And they said all of our citizens should have at least 2 years of college, because that's what you need to be successful in today's economy. And we're going to appropriate a small amount of money so that we can guarantee everyone that at least 70% of the cost of those 2 years of college will be covered with local scholarships. And one of the leaders in the chamber said our goal was to change K-12 to K-14, to focus people on more education. They brought in a local technical community college, they added facilities, but they changed the psychology of the region in a powerful way. If we go to the next slide, you'll see here the results of their effort were profound. They have these data because they applied to Harvard University for an award on government local leadership innovation, which they won, by the way. And you can see they did lose 12,600 manufacturing jobs, but they gained 22,000 jobs, service, healthcare, and professional areas. Let me give you a good example of what they gained. WellPoint, which is the parent company of Blue Cross Blue Shield, is a major employer in Kingsport. WellPoint could be located anywhere in the country. Really, all they need is capable people to do the analysis and the processing, primarily on the computer. And they grew in Kingsport because Kingsport was providing them with the educated people that they need. There is, though, I think one number on this slide that really stands out, and that's the first one, 3% increase in high school graduates. And that stands out for me because I spent a day there last summer and talked to chamber leaders and others. And they said something that was kind of controversial about Educate and Grow was that they didn't put any money into K-12. The relatively small amount they invested went into the higher education scholarships. Didn't put any money into the schools, but they got a 23% increase in the high school graduation. How did that happen? Well, I think that's culture change. And I'll give you an example. I think culture change starts at the kitchen table. In 1995, an 11th grader comes in, parents are sitting at the kitchen table, and he says, Mom, Dad, can I have the keys to the car? I want to go hang out with my friends. And they say, sure, go ahead. 10 years later, in 2005, 11th grader comes in, asks the same question about getting the car keys, and the parents say, I don't know. I really don't think so. You know, we know now that you not only have to complete high school, but you have to really learn something in high school because you need to go on to college for at least and you're not really working as hard as you can, so no, you can't have the car keys. I think you better stay home. Stay home and study. That's culture change. It doesn't cost anything. It's changed attitudes. In the case of Kingsport, what happened was the leaders in the business community went out and they talked in the schools, they talked to their employees, they talked in every situation they possibly could and said, you know, education really matters now. You need to learn things in high school, not just kind of tread water. And then you need to go to college and learn more because that's what you have to do to have a good job in the economy. And those acts of persuasion were fundamental in changing the economy of Kingsport. One of the things they did was they unlocked a lot of available federal and state financial aid for their students. So if we go to the next slide, one of the objectives of the Commission on Education and its partner, the South Carolina Higher Education Foundation, is to work with leaders in our communities to try to build a pervasive education culture. Spartanburg County has shown great leadership and is doing good things. We're going to work with private individuals across the state to try to make more people aware of the importance of education, higher education, for economic success and high quality of life. This is something government can't do. This is something that individuals must decide and where they must take leadership. We're certainly out, but ultimately it's up to them.
Gary, could I interrupt on that
Sure.
point? Let's think for a second, either in terms of Spartanburg, which is mentioned here, specifically some of the things that their leaders are doing, or let's say leaders in Aiken, or leaders in Florence, or name any other community in South Carolina. What are some specific things that they are doing and can be doing?
Well, we're going to try to work with a couple communities specifically, but one of the things that we think is very important is that leaders in the community get together and do some benchmarking about where there's a lot of data out there. We'd be happy to help with that data. We think that benchmarking ought to include also focus groups. They should get together and talk with people. What are your attitudes about education, and to what extent do you really understand its importance? And then we think they should set some goals for their community with a fairly short period of time, specific things that they can do. There's a rich palette of stuff that's available, from financial aid like this to simply financial aid advising, to tell people in a more organic way what kinds of opportunities are there. So to make a community-wide focused effort and really get out there and work to improve the services, but also to change the attitude. You know, you need an aggressive goal, and you need the leaders to be committed to it. Paul's coach doesn't start out the season by saying, well, we're going to play hard and, you know, kind of hope we do well. The football coach says, you know, we're going to go work hard to win every game and go to the playoffs and win the playoffs. People need to adopt that kind of an attitude of focus. So just in our final slide here, and we really would love to have questions and comments. We believe that if we're unified and we really focus on these key issues, that South Carolina can and will be successful. And we're doing everything we can to help transform life, but we believe it requires much broader participation.
As we wait to see if some questions are submitted, let's go back for just a second, Gary, and talk perhaps about some of the ways that the Commission on Higher Education is working with our public universities, our colleges, universities, and technical colleges specifically to try to pull together some of these threads of the action plan that was given to us by the General Assembly.
Well, there's, you know, I think, Ken, we're working on two levels. One is on a lot of the specific projects that you mentioned there, a lot of the activities. But we're also working to try to build, as we just said, the kind of a unity of purpose and clarity that really hasn't been the case here in the past. I think that haven't worked together well in higher education. But one of the things in a more unified approach is that clearly right now, people don't see a connection between investing in higher education and getting results that strengthen the economy and state's quality of life, and we need to do a better job providing a system that shows that. You know, some of the specific things, just to amplify, we are actively engaged with college and universities on adult education, and that really levels. One is the new front door that you mentioned, and trying to provide certificates and trying to provide a really supportive system for the adults who are returning. One of the things we know is true is they hear an ad on the radio about going back to college from colleges usually. And their first thought is, as you say, mathematics, I haven't had that for a long time. If I go back, I'll fail. They lack confidence. And so we're working on programs that will help them build their confidence. They are capable. They're just out of touch with specifics. We also have a great initiative with our university, SC, try to make it easier for them to get complete baccalaureate degrees in really high demand areas, primarily online, in a way that would be a lot more efficient than what we do. For example, in organizational leadership, which is kind of like business, and you happen to live in Florence, you could sign up for that degree at Francis Marion University and take some courses there, but you would take some online courses, and let's say your accounting course is taught by Aiken. That would be a lot more efficient and could be lower cost because one university would offer that course to all the other universities and count toward a degree. It's a complicated project, but a couple states have done something similar.
Very helpful. I think one of the things that I find exciting and challenging is that the study committee's report in making this proposal to achieve 30% of our population by 2030 really causes us as a state to reevaluate how many institutions do we need and how many students, what is the capacity of those existing institutions to produce these, the number of graduates that we are really seeking. And I think it's an interesting change in mindset. Instead of saying, wow, we have too many institutions, we need to eliminate duplication, we need to consolidate. Absolutely, we need efficiencies wherever possible. But the challenge of generating the capacity by the institutions to produce these graduates, I think, takes a reversal of mindset. And that we should look at our institutions as an asset, that we should look at them as the key, literally, the factory that will produce those graduates that lead the way for South Carolina's economy to improve. And so I think that's a challenge that the report gives us, puts squarely before us in black and white terms, dollar and cent terms, what the benefits will be for South Carolina if we pursue aggressively this higher education agenda. And I, for one, find it just very exciting and I think very attainable.
I think so too. I think we have made a huge step forward in showing the return on investment. I just, apropos of what you just said, I want to mention, I think our technical colleges and universities have really stepped up on the. More and more students, higher education is expensive. More and more are starting at two-year colleges with the hope of transfer. Our technical colleges are finding ways to accommodate them, even with significant. And the universities are providing bridge programs that provide the students with confidence that the courses will transfer toward the major, and also providing advising at the technical college so the students get the kind of support they know that will allow them to make a smooth transition to the university. So, I think we should be really proud of the college and university leadership.
I think one of those contact points, Gary, for individuals watching the seminar today or later online who are in the realtor community can certainly reach out to individuals, who they are in your communities, who serve on the boards of trustees of the colleges and universities and technical colleges, because those people both understand what's going on in the positive ways at the institutions, would be willing to work with community developing those metrics, those benchmarks, those goals, and doing some discussion groups and identifying within a community what can we achieve, what are we achieving currently, what do we want to achieve in the future. I think they are, all of these members of the boards of trustees, just a fabulous resource, a contact point at which this large endeavor from which this large endeavor can go forward.
Absolutely. I do think, we have talked a little bit in the abstract terms of the value of higher education to the state's economy, and made a couple of references to the realtor point of view, but just to be very pragmatic. If, we know, because it's a fact, that people who are more educated earn more money. And people who earn more money are going to want better and more housing. So if you're a realtor, it really, really matters whether your community is educated and whether it's moved, because that strengthens the community and improves the value of the real estate.
Retaining the jobs that we have now, as well as transitioning for the future, both are vitally important. Well, it looks as though there aren't any other questions that are being emailed in, so let me just say thank you again as chair of the Commission on Higher Education. It's a privilege to share this information with you today. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you found it challenging, even more than interesting, and that you'll take that ball and run with it. Thank you very much.
Second those sentiments, and just would add that our email addresses are on our website. Follow up with questions. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.